Welcome to Lord of Frights. Today, let's explore 5 chilling horror stories filled with mystery that unfold in hospitals, places where restless souls still linger. From the lurking ghost in the halls of Bangkok to the haunting cries of a child in an abandoned surgery wing, from the deadly room to the terrifying image of a woman in white. Are you brave enough to uncover these chilling tales? Join me in the exploration. Story 1. The Ghost in the Hospital Corridor in Thailand. In the heart of bustling Bangkok, there stood a hospital renowned for its modern facilities, but infamous for the ghostly tales that haunted its halls. As the sun set and the city fell into darkness, the sterile white walls of the hospital seemed to grow colder. The night shift nurses were particularly uneasy, often exchanging nervous glances as they made their rounds. One particular nurse, Ploy, had heard whispers about a tall figure dressed in white who roamed the corridors at night. Many believed it to be the spirit of a patient who had died after surgery, but Ploy dismissed these tales as mere superstition until she encountered the ghost herself. It was a humid evening when Ploy began her shift. The air felt thick with tension, and an inexplicable chill swept through the hallways. As she moved past the surgical wing, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A tall man in a white hospital gown stood at the end of the corridor, his back turned to her. Her heart raced. Summoning her courage, she called out, "Sir, are you lost?" He did not respond. Instead, he slowly turned around. Ploy's breath caught in her throat as she met his gaze. His eyes were hollow, and his skin was an ashen gray, as if life had drained from him. Terrified, she took a step back, but he simply vanished into thin air. The silence of the corridor was deafening. After that night, Ploy couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She noticed that each time she walked past the surgical wing, the air grew colder, and shadows danced along the walls. Other nurses reported similar sightings, claiming they felt a presence following them. One night, Ploy gathered the courage to return to the corridor with a flashlight, determined to confront her fears. As she approached the surgical wing, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the hallway, extinguishing her flashlight. In the darkness, she heard a soft whisper, "Help me." Panic set in as she stumbled back, her heart racing. The ghost reappeared before her, his expression filled with sorrow. It was as if he was pleading for release from his torment. Days turned into weeks, and Ploy became consumed by the ghost's presence. Unable to find peace, she sought the advice of a local monk. The monk explained that the man's spirit was trapped due to unresolved pain. Ploy returned to the hospital, determined to help him. She gathered her fellow nurses and held a small ceremony, lighting incense and praying for his spirit to find peace. That night, as the nurses stood in the dark corridor, they felt a warm breeze sweep, carrying with it a sense of relief. The tall figure appeared one last time, his face softer, almost grateful. With a final nod, he disappeared, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of calm. The haunting had ceased, but the memory of that ghost would linger in the hearts of the nurses forever. Story 2. The Crying Child in the Abandoned Surgery Wing. In a small, unassuming town in the U.S., there was a hospital with a dark history. The surgery wing had been abandoned for years after a tragic incident involving a newborn. Staff had reported hearing the chilling cries of a baby echoing through the empty halls, but no one had been able to identify the source. One stormy night, Dr. Emily Carter, a compassionate young surgeon, was working late to catch up on paperwork. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the air felt charged with an unsettling energy. As she passed the closed doors of the abandoned wing, a faint sound caught her attention, a soft, haunting cry of a child. Curiosity piqued. Emily approached the doors. The dim light flickered as she reached for the handle, feeling a sudden chill sweep over her. As she stepped inside, the air thickened and the cries grew louder, echoing off the cold, sterile walls. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" Silence enveloped her, but the cries continued. They seemed to lead her deeper into the abandoned wing. Following the sound, she found herself in an old operating room, the equipment covered in dust, as if frozen in time. The cries intensified, and she felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and a vision materialized before her, an ethereal figure of a woman holding a baby, tears streaming down her face. Emily's heart raced as she realized the woman was searching for her lost child. The child's cries were filled with anguish, a plea for help that pierced Emily's heart. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily began to investigate the hospital's archives. She discovered that the baby had died due to medical negligence, a tragic error that had left the mother devastated. The woman's spirit was tethered to the hospital, mourning the loss of her child. With this knowledge, Emily returned to the abandoned wing, determined to offer comfort. She lit candles and spoke softly to the spirit, acknowledging her pain. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she whispered. "You are not forgotten." As she spoke, the cries softened, and the room began to warm. The figure of the woman appeared once more, her expression shifting from sorrow to gratitude. With a final, fleeting smile, she faded away, taking the child's cries with her. The air grew lighter, and Emily felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The abandoned wing, once filled with grief, now held a different energy, a space where the echoes of the past could finally rest. From that day forward, the cries ceased, and the hospital could breathe easier, free from the burden of the past. Story 3. The Death Room in the American Hospital. In a decrepit wing of a hospital in the U.S., there existed a room that was shrouded in mystery and fear. Known among staff as the Death Room, it was a place where patients were said to inexplicably perish within 24 hours of being admitted. Rumors spread that the room was haunted by the spirit of a doctor who had taken his own life there, claiming the souls of the vulnerable patients he encountered. Nurse Angela, known for her strong will and compassion, had always heard the chilling tales, but had never witnessed anything herself. That changed when she was assigned to care for an elderly man named Mr. Jenkins, who had been admitted for severe respiratory issues. Despite his frail condition, he was alert and coherent, sharing stories of his life and family. On the third day of his admission, Mr. Jenkins was moved to the infamous room due to a lack of available beds. Angela felt an uneasy knot in her stomach as she escorted him down the dimly lit corridor. "You'll be all right," she reassured him, though her own voice trembled with apprehension. That night, Angela was on duty when she received the call. Mr. Jenkins had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. Rushing to the room, she found him gasping for breath, his face twisted in fear. "Help me," he croaked, his eyes wide with terror. Just as she was about to administer aid, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, she felt a cold presence sweep over her, paralyzing her with fear. She could barely move as she heard a whisper, barely audible over Mr. Jenkins' labored breathing. "Join me, it's time." With a surge of adrenaline, Angela flicked on her flashlight, illuminating the room. To her horror, she saw the silhouette of a man standing at the foot of the bed, tall, gaunt, and dressed in a white coat, his eyes empty voids. Angela screamed and rushed to the patient, but it was too late. Mr. Jenkins' eyes glazed over, and he took his last breath. The incident sent shockwaves through the hospital. Staff were frightened, and many refused to enter the room again. Over the following weeks, several other patients admitted to the room suffered the same fate, each one succumbing within 24 hours. Determined to put an end to the terror, Angela sought the help of a local medium. The medium revealed that the spirit of the doctor was angry, unable to move on due to guilt over his own demise. He was trapped, and his rage manifested in the room, pulling in those who were weakest. With this knowledge, Angela organized a cleansing ritual. The staff gathered in the room, lighting candles and chanting prayers. As the atmosphere thickened with tension, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. Angela's heart raced as she felt the presence intensify, threatening to overwhelm them. But as they continued to chant, a warmth began to fill the room. The oppressive energy started to dissipate, and the air lightened. Suddenly, the silhouette of the doctor appeared once more, but this time he looked different, sadder, almost peaceful. With a final nod, he faded into the ether, leaving behind a lingering warmth. The death room was transformed. Patients who were later admitted experienced a sense of calm, and the strange occurrences ceased. Angela felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she realized they had freed the spirit, allowing both the doctor and his victims to find peace at last. Story 4. The Woman in White at the Hospital in England. In a centuries-old hospital in England, there was a legend that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. Patients and nurses spoke in hushed whispers about the woman in white who roamed the halls at night. Dressed in a flowing hospital gown, her face was obscured, but when approached, her features would twist into something grotesque, with hollow eye sockets that seemed to bore into your soul. One night, Nurse Claire was assigned the late shift, her heart racing with the anticipation of encountering the ghost. She had heard the stories but never believed them, until she experienced the chilling events that would change her forever. As the clock struck midnight, the hospital was eerily silent. The faint beeping of machines and distant murmurs were the only sounds. Claire walked through the dimly lit corridors, checking on patients, when she felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature dropped, and the lights flickered ominously. Suddenly, from the corner of her eye, Claire caught sight of the woman in white. Panic surged through her as she watched the figure glide effortlessly down the hall, her hair floating as if underwater. Gathering her courage, Claire called out, "Excuse me, are you all right?" But the woman did not respond. Instead, she turned slowly, revealing a face that sent ice coursing through Claire's veins. Her features were disfigured, with empty eye sockets staring back at her. Claire stumbled backward, her heart racing. The ghostly figure began to advance, and Claire felt an overpowering sense of dread. She remembered the stories. The woman was said to be a patient who had died from neglect. Could this spirit be seeking revenge for her untimely demise? Desperate to escape, Claire fled to the nurse's station, breathless and shaking. Her colleagues listened in disbelief as she recounted her encounter. The next few nights, the sightings continued, each one more terrifying than the last. Patients reported seeing the woman hovering at the foot of their beds, and nurses claimed they felt cold fingers graze their necks as they passed. Determined to confront the spirit, Claire returned to the haunted hallway one final time. Armed with a flashlight and a candle, she called out, "Why are you here? What do you want?" The air thickened, and a cold wind swept through the corridor, extinguishing her candle. In the darkness, Claire heard a soft weeping, the voice filled with despair. "Help me, please." Her heart ached with empathy. This was not a vengeful spirit, but a soul lost in sorrow. Claire realized that the woman was seeking acknowledgement of her suffering. Returning to the nurse's station, Claire gathered her colleagues and organized a memorial for the woman. They lit candles and shared stories of those who had passed within the hospital walls, honoring the forgotten souls. That night, as they stood together in the hallway, the air shifted. The oppressive weight lifted, and they felt a warm breeze sweep through, carrying with it the whispers of gratitude. The woman in white was finally at peace, her spirit released from the shackles of despair. The sightings ceased, and the hospital felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. Claire knew they had made a difference, ensuring that no one would be forgotten again. Story 5. The Farewell from the Emergency Room. In a busy emergency room in the U.S., Dr. Michael Harrison was accustomed to the chaotic environment, the sirens blaring, the frantic energy of nurses rushing to save lives. But one fateful night would challenge everything he believed about life and death. It was late, and the room was quieter than usual when a patient, an elderly man, was rushed in after a heart attack. Despite Dr. Harrison's best efforts, the man did not survive. After calling the time of death, he felt a heaviness settle over him. He'd faced death many times, but each one weighed on his conscience like a stone. Just as he turned to leave, the intercom crackled to life. Dr. Harrison froze as he heard a voice, a familiar voice, softly saying, "Goodbye, doctor." His heart raced. It was the voice of the deceased patient. Confused and terrified, he glanced around the room, but there was no one else present. "Hello?" He called into the intercom, but only silence answered. The chill of the room intensified, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Was he losing his mind? A sense of dread washed over him as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Over the following days, whispers spread throughout the hospital. Staff members began to share their own supernatural encounters, each story more chilling than the last. Some reported seeing shadowy figures flit by in their peripheral vision, while others described feeling icy fingers graze their arms in empty hallways. Dr. Harrison could not shake the memory of that voice. Was it truly the spirit of the man he had failed, thanking him for his care? Or was it a warning, a sign that he was now tethered to the spirit world? The lines between life and death began to blur as he wrestled with questions that offered no answers. The following week, during a particularly hectic night shift, Dr. Harrison was caught off guard by a patient in the waiting room. The man was frantic, claiming he had seen his deceased wife standing at the foot of his bed, whispering for him to join her. The eeriness of the situation sent chills down Dr. Harrison's spine, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Later that night, while alone in the break room, he was startled by a loud crash. Rushing to investigate, he found a medical cart had tipped over, scattered with supplies. As he bent down to pick them up, he heard a familiar voice again, this time more insistent. "Michael, help me." Frightened, he called for the other staff, but they were nowhere in sight. He followed the sound, heart pounding, until he reached the quiet corner of the ER. There in the shadows, he saw the silhouette of the elderly man, his face still twisted in agony. "Why won't you let me go?" the figure pleaded, his voice a haunting echo in the stillness. Dr. Harrison's breath hitched, and he felt a wave of sorrow wash over him. With newfound resolve, he spoke softly, "I'm sorry for what happened. You deserve peace." The figure's expression softened, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of relief in his eyes. With a nod, he faded into the darkness, leaving behind a stillness that resonated throughout the room. From that night onward, Dr. Harrison became a source of comfort for families facing loss. He shared stories of the deceased with their loved ones, allowing them to acknowledge their pain and honor their memories. The echoes of the past lingered, but he knew that some spirits would find their way home, forever connected to the place where they last felt love. Story 6. The Final Goodbye from the Emergency Room. In the frenetic world of a busy emergency room, Dr. Michael Harrison was well acquainted with the cycle of life and death. Every day brought its own challenges, but one fateful night would etch itself into his memory forever. After a particularly chaotic shift, a frail old man was wheeled in, gasping for breath. Despite Dr. Harrison's best efforts, the man succumbed to his condition. As he called the time of death, he felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, a reminder of the fragility of life. Just as he turned to leave, the intercom crackled to life, sending chills down his spine. "Goodbye, doctor," a voice echoed. It was the voice of the deceased man, soft yet distinct. Dr. Harrison's heart raced as he turned toward the intercom, disbelief clouding his mind. "Is anyone there?" he called out, but only silence met him. The air around him thickened, and an uneasy feeling crept in. Had he just imagined it? Had exhaustion finally taken its toll? Days passed, and the unsettling incident haunted Dr. Harrison. Whispers among the staff grew, with many sharing their eerie experiences. Some had seen flickering lights, while others claimed to feel an inexplicable presence lurking in the shadows. Determined to make sense of the mystery, Dr. Harrison delved into the hospital's history, uncovering tales of tragedy and loss that echoed through the halls. One night, while reviewing the archives, he stumbled upon the story of the very patient he had lost. The man had a family, and he had not been able to say goodbye. That same night, while alone in the break room, Dr. Harrison was struck by the urge to reach out to the man's family. Just then, the lights flickered, and he heard the voice again, clearer this time. "Thank you, doctor." The air turned cold, and he felt a presence beside him, an overwhelming sense of gratitude washing over him. Gathering his courage, Dr. Harrison decided to host a small memorial for the patients who had passed away, inviting their families to share their stories. The night of the memorial, the atmosphere was heavy with emotion as families gathered, sharing laughter and tears. As they lit candles in honor of their loved ones, a warm breeze swept through the room, and for a brief moment, they all felt a connection, a sense of closure that transcended the boundaries of life and death. From that day forward, Dr. Harrison dedicated himself to honoring those lost in the emergency room. The tales of the past became a source of healing, reminding everyone that while death may separate them, love endures, and the echoes of their stories will forever resonate in the hospital's halls.